Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep today into one single source, but trust me, it's a fascinating one. It's Andrew Tate's interview on the Candace Owens show. This conversation had so much interesting stuff packed in. Masculinity, freedom, societal collapse even, we figured. It deserves its own deep dive, so buckle up. We're going to unpack all the most, thought-provoking bits, give you the cheat sheet version of this wild discussion.
Yeah, right away. What really struck me was how Tate dismisses data and experts, almost like he's proud of it. He uses this almost folksy example, like watching ice melt in a glass, to try to cast doubt on climate change.
Yeah, it seems like he's really tapping into that distrust of institutions we see everywhere these days. It's like he's saying, don't just believe anything you hear from so-called experts.
Exactly, and while, it is important to think critically. Cherry-picking data to fit a narrative is dangerous, especially with a complex topic like climate change. And it's interesting how this distrust of authority becomes a recurring theme.
Right. He even uses this term, the matrix, to describe this system he sees that's kind of pushing these agendas that he opposes.
It's like he's saying there are these unseen forces that are manipulating everything. And he specifically points to things like globalism and the push for LGBTQ plus rights as like evidence of this matrix at work.
And to illustrate this point, he brings up a really specific example, the French election with Macron. He claims that Macron is like a puppet of these forces, and that the election was rigged against his opponents.
And this is where it gets really interesting. He connects Macron's alleged homosexuality to this idea that the matrix is, weakening masculinity and imposing a new world order. It almost feels like he's tapping into this broader anxiety that people feel about shifting power dynamics and changing social norms.
That leads us to one of Tate's most infamous terms, the straight homo. It's a deliberately provocative label.
Right.
He's using this to describe men who, despite being heterosexual, conform to what he sees as like, emasculating societal expectations.
So he's basically arguing that these men lack the core traits of true masculinity: strength, bravery, a willingness to confront challenges.
It's so fascinating how he contrasts his own view of masculinity with someone like Jordan Peterson, who many people see as a champion of traditional male roles.
Yeah, it's almost like two different generations take on masculinity. Peterson emphasizing responsibility and stoicism, while Tate is pushing for this more aggressive, almost combative approach. And that ties directly into another key point: the importance of violence in Tate's worldview. He argues that men have this inherent capacity for violence that needs to be channeled protectively. And to illustrate this, he shares a story about his own son's natural inclination toward rough and tumble play.
So it's not about violence for the sake of violence, but more about harnessing that, primal energy for good.
Right, and it's fascinating how he ties this back to this overall narrative of societal decline. He argues that suppressing this natural male aggression leads to all sorts of problems: mental health issues, the erosion of traditional values. And he even claims that this is pushing the West towards a complete breakdown.
He uses some pretty stark examples to support this, talking about declining birth rates, mass immigration, and this perceived loss of traditional values.
Yeah, it's like he's painting this picture of a society that's teetering on the brink of collapse. And a big part of this, according to Tate, is that true freedom is an illusion.
He brings up things like censorship, social pressure to conform as evidence. He even compares restrictions on free speech in the West versus Russia, almost like tongue-in-cheek. But it makes you question, are we really as free as we think we are?
What's fascinating is how he connects this idea of restrictive freedom back to his point about the matrix. It's like he's saying that these unseen forces are limiting our choices on purpose, manipulating us into accepting a world that benefits them.
And this leads us to another one of Tate's core messages: the importance of self-reliance and independence. He really seems to believe that. Resisting this matrix starts with taking control of your own life.
And to illustrate this point, he and Candace Owens share this story about one of her young employees who learned his skills through Hustle University, Tate's online program. This employee is thriving despite the attacks on the program, almost as if to prove that defying the conventional path can lead to success.
It plays into that whole bootstrap mentality. You don't need the system. You can create your own path.
Right. And while it is a compelling narrative, it also makes you wonder, how valid is this program really? And is this success story really representative?
It seems like Tate wants to empower people to take control. But he's pushing a very specific worldview. And I think that's what makes it so interesting. It makes you think critically about these big ideas, even if you don't agree with everything he says.
So what do you think? What stood out to you the most? in this first part of their conversation? Well, for me, the most thought-provoking thing is how Tate's message, while extreme, seems to resonate with a certain group of men who feel disillusioned or alienated by current cultural trends. It's like he's offering a roadmap to reclaiming this version of masculinity that they feel is being lost.
And he doesn't hold back when calling out those straight homos,
Yeah.
urging them to
Mm.
embrace their inner fire
Yeah.
and confront their fears. It's like he's drawing a line. You're either with him or against him.
Yeah, he paints this stark contrast between conforming to society's expectations and rebelling against them. His argument is that true fulfillment comes from challenging the status quo, but that can be empowering and dangerous, depending on how it's interpreted.
He also pulls no punches
Yeah.
when it comes to his critiques. Of those he disagrees with, some might even say his rhetoric is inflammatory, but it's undeniably effective.
He's a master at tapping into those anxieties and frustrations that people feel, and he offers this simple, albeit controversial, explanation for how complex the modern world is. And one major target of his seems to be the media and what he calls the elite.
He repeatedly accuses them of pushing agendas that only benefit themselves, while ignoring the concerns of everyday people. It's a populist message that resonates with those who feel unheard or betrayed by those in power.
He even goes as far as claiming that there's a vast conspiracy to suppress dissenting voices and to control the narrative. He brings up examples like the removal of references to Bill Clinton and Jeffrey Epstein from Clinton's Wikipedia page and the alleged suppression of information about an attempt on Trump's life.
And he ties this all back to that matrix idea, this idea of a hidden system that's pulling the strings.
It creates this chilling image of a world where the truth is constantly being manipulated, and anyone who questions the official narrative is silenced.
And this feeds directly into his prediction that America, and the West in general, is heading towards societal collapse. He uses several points to support this bleak outlook. He points to, rising economic inequality, increasing political polarization, and these ongoing cultural shifts as evidence of this impending breakdown.
To really drive this point home, he uses a really powerful metaphor, comparing modern Western society to ancient Rome, just before its fall.
It evokes this image of a once great civilization crumbling from within because of decadence and moral decay.
And according to Tate, a major contributing factor to this is the perceived decline of masculinity.
He links this to the rise of feminism, which he sees as having undermined traditional gender roles and weakened men's sense of purpose and responsibility.
He even suggests that declining birth rates are a direct result of men finding feminist women less desirable.
To contrast this, he points to countries with more traditional cultures, where men are still seen as protectors and providers, and women embrace their roles as mothers and homemakers. And then he brings in another issue, immigration. He suggests that Western countries are replacing their native populations on purpose with people who are more willing to work for low wages and accept less freedom.
It's a very charged argument that plays on fears about demographic change and the erosion of national identity, and it leads him to conclude that violent conflict is inevitable.
He argues that the West, with its focus on comfort and political correctness, is totally unprepared for this coming clash. He believes that. Men have lost touch with their natural aggression, making them vulnerable to those who are willing to use force.
And then he makes this really unsettling connection between childhood trauma, specifically sexual abuse, and the development of psychopathic tendencies in leaders.
It's a disturbing thought that some of the world's most powerful people might actually get pleasure from the suffering of others.
He brings up examples like Vlad the Impaler, the notoriously brutal Romanian ruler, and suggests that his sadistic tendencies were rooted in his own childhood abuse.
He also blames the amount of pornography.
Yeah.
And the desensitization to violence
for contributing to this decline in empathy and morality.
It's like he believes we live in a culture that's becoming more and more depraved and detached from traditional values.
And he argues that this detachment from reality allows people to accept things that are clearly harmful or illogical.
He points to the COVID-19 pandemic and how willing so many people were to blindly follow government mandates.
As a prime example, even when those mandates contradicted common sense or scientific evidence, he even suggests that all this focus on issues like climate change and transgender rights is a distraction from the real problems facing society, a way to manipulate people and prevent them from seeing the true threats to their freedom and well-being.
It all comes back around to his point about true freedom becoming more rare in the West.
He compares the situation in Western countries to more authoritarian regimes like Russia arguing that, despite the illusion of freedom we have here, restrictions on free speech are actually more severe.
He even uses his own experiences with censorship and attempts to silence him, as
It
evidently.
all feeds into this narrative of him being this truth teller who's persecuted for challenging the system, someone who speaks truth to power and faces the consequences.
And this ties into his emphasis on financial independence. As a way to resist this control, he promotes Hustle University as a path to escape the corporate world and achieve success on your own terms.
Yeah, he tells this compelling story about Candace Owens' young employee who learned everything he knows from Hustle University. And he's thriving. Despite the attacks on the program, it's presented as proof that you can create your own path and find success outside of the traditional system.
But he does acknowledge that this path isn't easy. He talks about the constant attacks he gets from the media and the Matrix, emphasizing that you need resilience and determination to overcome those obstacles. He even suggests that speaking out against the establishment can be dangerous.
He argues that anyone who challenges the status quo is often met with hostility and attempts to silence them. And he uses straight homo to describe those who conform to these expectations, arguing that they've lost touch with their masculinity and aren't able to protect themselves or their families.
He contrasts this with his own vision of masculinity, which emphasizes strength, bravery, and willingness to confront challenges head-on.
And to drive home his point, he uses this striking metaphor, comparing these men to eunuchs, implying they've been castrated by political correctness and social pressure.
It's a provocative image. That conveys just how much disdain he has for those he sees as having abandoned those masculine roles.
He even goes so far as to suggest that these men are partially to blame for the decline of Western civilization, arguing that their passivity and lack of leadership have allowed the Matrix to take control.
It's a bleak but compelling message that plays on those anxieties about the future of the West.
And even though his solutions might seem extreme, to some, they offer a sense of clarity and purpose to those who feel lost and disillusioned by the modern world. He offers a different perspective on fear, arguing that it's a sign of intelligence.
He suggests that fear is a natural response to danger, and those who can recognize and respond to threats are more likely to survive. He makes a pretty provocative claim that violence is inherent to humans, and that trying to eliminate it completely is impossible and even dangerous. He suggests that violence is sometimes necessary for self-defense, protecting the weak, and upholding justice. He even uses war as an example. He argues that while war is horrible, sometimes it's necessary to prevent even worse things, and that anyone who isn't willing to fight for what they believe in will be subjugated by those who are. It's a sobering thought that peace and freedom often come at a price.
He uses a historical example, the Roman Empire, and how its decline was partly caused by its unwillingness to have a strong military and defend its borders.
He suggests the same thing is happening in the West today, and unless we're willing to face the threats we face, we'll suffer the same fate.
He contrasts this with the situation in countries like Russia and China, arguing that they're more willing to assert their power and defend their interests.
He even praises Vladimir Putin, a leader who's demonized in the West, arguing
that he's a strong and decisive leader who is unafraid to stand up to his enemies. It's a controversial view, for sure, but it reflects his belief that strength and assertiveness are essential for leadership in the world today.
He even argues that the West's focus on diplomacy and negotiation is a sign of weakness. That will be our downfall.
He suggests that our enemies will exploit this and will be forced to make concessions that will undermine our values and way of life.
It's a bleak outlook, but one that's based on a deep understanding of history and human nature.
He argues that the world is dangerous, and anyone unwilling to recognize and respond to threats will be consumed by them.
And he brings it back to personal responsibility, arguing that everyone has a duty to become strong and resilient, to deal with the challenges we face.
He suggests that this means physical fitness, mental toughness, financial independence, and standing up for what you believe in, even when others oppose you.
He even encourages listeners to embrace confrontation, arguing that overcoming challenges is how we grow and develop character.
He suggests that we shouldn't avoid conflict, but seek it out to test our limits and prove our worth.
He uses this analogy, comparing life to a video game, where the goal isn't to avoid danger, but to overcome obstacles and level up.
It's a gamified approach to self-improvement that might resonate with a certain audience, especially young men who like challenges and getting that sense of accomplishment from overcoming things.
He even suggests that anyone who avoids confrontation is betraying themselves.
Denying themselves the chance to grow and be their best selves, it's a powerful message that challenges us to step outside of what's comfortable and embrace the challenges life throws at us,
He even argues that chasing comfort and security can be a form of weakness.
leading to complacency and making us less able to deal with adversity. He suggests that true strength comes from being able to adapt to change, overcome obstacles, and come out of tough situations stronger and more resilient.
It's a message that really resonates with people who are drawn to that, rugged, individualistic approach to life.
He uses the analogy of a wild animal, arguing that anyone who's constantly sheltered
Yeah.
becomes domesticated and loses those survival instincts.
He suggests that the same thing can happen to humans. And we need to challenge ourselves to keep that edge and be able to thrive in a world that can be dangerous.
It's a call to reclaim our primal nature and embrace challenges to make us stronger.
He even argues that the modern world's focus on safety and comfort is making us weaker.
He suggests that by shielding ourselves from risk, we're actually becoming more vulnerable to the challenges life throws at us. He uses this provocative analogy, comparing modern humans to zoo animals, arguing that we're becoming more domesticated and dependent on these artificial environments.
He suggests that this is making us soft, physically and mentally.
And we're losing those instincts and skills that are essential for thriving. He even argues that the rise of technology and social media is part of this decline, creating this generation more concerned with virtual reality than the actual world.
He suggests that these technologies are making us more passive, more isolated,
Yeah.
and less able to deal with real-life challenges.
It's kind of a sobering thought that the things that are supposed to make our lives easier could actually be making us weaker.
He even goes so far as to say that we're becoming slaves to our own technology, letting it control us.
He encourages his listeners to disconnect from these things and reconnect with the natural world, arguing that it's essential for getting back our strength and sense of purpose.
He uses the analogy of a caged bird, suggesting that we need to break free from the bars of technology and rediscover that freedom of flight. It's a powerful image, this idea of breaking free from the modern world and reclaiming our primal nature.
And he challenges his listeners to ask themselves some really tough questions. What do you stand for? What are you willing to fight for? What are you willing to fight for?
What kind of man do you want to be? He argues that true freedom comes from knowing what your purpose is and being willing to defend what you believe in, even when it's hard.
He even suggests that the biggest danger we face isn't some outside threat, but that weakness and complacency that's eating away at our societies from the inside.
It's a call to action, to get back our strength, our independence, our sense of purpose.
It might be controversial, but it definitely speaks to people who are looking for something different in a world that feels confusing and overwhelming.
Yeah, it's a powerful call to action. Like he's saying, wake up, stop being a sheep, and take control. Because he's not just talking about like physical strength.
Right. He's emphasizing mental resilience, self-belief, having the courage to stand up for what you believe in. He uses this interesting analogy of this fire burning inside every man.
Oh, yeah. He says you can either direct that fire outward to achieve your goals and overcome obstacles, or you can let it consume you from within.
Exactly. He's suggesting that avoiding confrontation, trying to please everyone, ultimately leads to...
It's that kind of spiritual.
It's pretty intense. It's like he's challenging us to look at our own lives and figure out, what are we really willing to stand for?
And that's what makes this conversation so compelling. Even if you don't agree with Tate on everything, it forces you to think about the world, your place in it, and what really matters. It pushes you to define your own values and beliefs.
So for all those straight homos out there, what's Tate's advice?
Well, he urges them to embrace that inner fire, confront those fears, and stop letting the matrix run their lives. He reminds them that confrontation is going to happen anyway, so it's better to choose your battles and fight for what you believe in.
In a world that's so focused on comfort and fitting in, it makes you wonder, what does it even mean to be truly free?
That's the question he leaves us with, and it's a powerful one. What are you willing to sacrifice for freedom? What are you willing to fight for?
It's a lot to think about. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with that challenge. Think about your own definition of masculinity, of freedom, and the future you want to create. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.